yes, always great to be back at TGIF. I really appreciate the opportunity. Yeah, I got an opportunity to work at Collage Church. It's the in Ilaris Park. It's a community there, but I'm more involved with their theological school. So I work for Excel Theological Training Academy. I'm the manager of all the assessments and all work with all the assessors and facilitators, but I also give class to the students there. Yeah, it's but basic the whole theological curriculum. We're only an NQF 5 level at the moment, but we are working towards an NQF 7 qualification, bachelor's qualification. Yeah. Yeah, as Thorsten said, I'm busy studying my master's in philosophy with SES. I really love it. It's amazing. If you can study with SES, you should. It's really an amazing place and great philosophical school as well, the Thomistic and moderate realist philosophical school of studies. So yeah, like I said, always great for me to be back here. I love you guys. You are an amazing group of people, and to wake up and be here at 6:30 in the morning on a Friday and to come and listen to intellectual discussions. But so, yeah, this morning we will be doing the topic of deism or the worldview of deism, however you want to pronounce it. But I think before we start, can I just pray for us? It's just an important thing. Thank you, Lord, that we as Christians and everyone here can just come together and look at this worldview, Lord. But I pray that you will give us insight and that you will give us clarity on how to deal with the worldview of deism. And if they are maybe deistic ideas that we hold to, that we will realize that and embrace the Christian worldview. And but also may we see the reasons why Christian theism is the worldview that corresponds more to reality than deism. In Jesus' name, amen. Okay, so the worldview of deism started in mainly after, well, during the Enlightenment period, but it also with the Renaissance and with findings of the designs and things of Leonardo da Vinci, Galileo Galilei, Isaac Newton, and so forth. With their scientific discoveries, people started to see this thing that the world and the universe, as they knew it back then, are built on certain laws, like the law of gravity, for example. And also, there was a big debate, especially between the Catholic Church and like Galileo, for example, where Galileo challenged the ideas that where the church and the world at that time had the view that the earth is the center of the universe, it's flat, and the sun and the moon and all the planets orbits around it. Galileo, of course, with his discovery said, no, that's not the case. The earth is round and it revolves around the sun, and so forth. And the church basically, Galileo never wanted to um, sort of what's the word, become an enemy of the church. He's just say, he wanted to tell the church, look, no, this doesn't discredit the Bible or doesn't discredit God or anything like that. But he said our interpretation just of the Bible needs to change, because the Catholic Church was firmly on, no, look at, especially in the Psalms, the earth is set on its four pillars, on its foundations. And they took examples, for example, with Joshua. No, God made the sun stand still. So Galileo, what you are saying, they said, and what the Bible says doesn't correspond with one another. And Galileo said, no, I hear what you're saying, but we need to reinterpret the scriptures in accordance with uh, understanding it. The scriptures are written from a human's perspective. It is divinely inspired at the same time. But I mean, we still speak like that. I mean, we speak about the sun setting, the sun rising. That's not really what happens. We know that it's the earth that is tilting. That's how we perceive it. And there's nothing wrong in speaking that way. It's not really actually what's happening. But Galileo used the same type of argument to say, we just need to understand that this was written not to give scientific or evidence or proof. It is more something else that the Bible's trying to describe of God and his majesty and everything. But that's where it sort of started. And then as the years progressed and you had certain philosophers coming into the picture, and we'll look at them now on the next slide, These are the main philosophers. There's obviously a lot more, many others that have contributed to this worldview. But these are some of the main philosophers that started with ideas and certain philosophical ideas that gave us this worldview of deism at the end. Some of the philosophers weren't necessarily deists. I will check now what deism is, but they did give certain ideas in questioning the scholastic, medieval, traditional Christian thought of God and so forth. And so the first couple of guys I want to look at is, of course, the first one is on the next slide, Rene Descartes. Um, now, Descartes himself was a very devout Catholic also, and we all know Descartes from his famous "Cogito ergo sum," I think, therefore I am statement. Um, Descartes had a big distrust in sensical experience, where he distrusted the things we perceive from the senses. Can we really trust them? And he used examples like if you put a stick in the water, it looks as if it goes skew down, or if you are in the desert, you will start hallucinating, or see these mirages, or if you are use alcohol or whatever, your senses are also now not in a good place. So Descartes asked the question, can we really trust our senses? And he also asked the question, what if this God or whoever gave me these sensical experience, what if he's not deceiving me? At the same time. Now, Descartes, what did convince him at the end that he could trust in his senses was his version of the ontological argument. He said, we all have a notion of this perfect being or what perfection is, and there needs to be a perfect being behind that. Um, and Descartes said, if God is perfect, he cannot deceive me because deception is a form of imperfection. It's not being morally perfect in the eyes of Descartes. So that's why Descartes in the end did say we can trust the senses eventually in the end of his life, because this perfect being, which we have a notion of, will not deceive me. But the famous statement, I think, therefore I am, was Descartes asked the question, um, can, am I sitting in my rocking chair now, or am I sleeping in my bed, or am I actually in a boiling pot? He said, I can't tell the difference, but the fact that I can think about it tells me I exist. Therefore, the statement, I think, therefore I am. And then the next guy, sorry, is Immanuel Kant, who also, Norman Geisler made the famous statement, Kant has influenced more people than Jesus Christ in the last century. Um, and of course, Geisler is a Christian. He doesn't mean it disrespectful towards Christ. It's just the reality of our day and age, the Kantian philosophy. And both Descartes and Kant were what we call anti-realists, meaning they will say you can't know reality. We can't trust the senses. Kant himself also had a big distrust in the senses. He will tell you that chair you see, it's not that Kant said that doesn't exist. He says you will always perceive it through the senses. You will never know it as it actually is. You will always know it through the senses. And that's why he distrusted in that. So you've referred to the phenomena and the categories by saying there are things in us, in our mind, that we know without sensical experience, which we can trust, like logic and morality and the laws of arithmetic and mathematics, for example. And Descartes had the same. They referred to a priori knowledge, which means knowledge that we have without experience. Because they had this big distrust in the senses. But they all questioned, but they also didn't believe anymore in the theistic God. They believed in that there is a God, and Kant also said, we can't prove God scientifically, but we live every day as if he exists, which is a bit of a self-contradiction because there is using some form of empirical evidence to actually make that statement. So these guys laid some of these philosophical ideas. Kant also was responsible for the whole separation between religion and science, or some of the main ideas. He said you can't prove religion through science. Science and religion should not mix, and that's why many people, when people speak today about the secular world, or I have a secular job, And then I go to church on Sunday. That's pure Kantian influence right there. You have there. We should not think that way as Christians. In my job, my work I do every day, I also should uh, do all that to the glory of God. It's also a spiritual matter. But the next guy, of course, this guy was one of the big philosophers, the British philosopher David Hume, and he had a whole big argument against the possibility of miracles. And of course, the Bible, Christian theism, who believes in the Bible, which is full of miracles, um, that he said, well, that is not possible because miracles go against or breaks natural law. And he also said, I never experienced a miracle in my life, therefore miracles are not possible. And so Hume said, and of course, like the next guy also, next slide, Thomas Jefferson was one of the, also you get today the Jefferson Bible, where what Jefferson does, well, because he's a deist, he tore out all the miracles in his Bible because miracles are not possible. And the Bible has hundreds of miracles. And so like I said, you still get today the Jefferson Bible. But these are some of the guys' influences over in history that led to this worldview called deism. So on the next slide, when we look now at the worldview of deism, just to unpack it, is the question of what is ultimate reality in this worldview. So for the deists, that they still believe on the next slide that God created the universe, that there is a God or a creator behind this universe, um, and he put the laws of nature in place so that the universe, by the laws that he put in place, will run on itself and will continue on itself. It's like a clock maker. The clock designer makes the clock, puts all the gears and components in place, and the clock is running and ticking down on its own. The big difference between deism and theism, therefore, is that the God of deism is not involved with his creation. He has separated himself from his creation, and he can also not intervene into the universe because the laws of nature are set. The laws of nature sort of prohibits him from interacting with his creation. Um, so on the next slide, you get two types of deists. You get warm deists and cold deists. Yeah. So warm deists will say, and the famous the guy with the roulette, the whole French Revolution, Maximilien Robespierre, was what we call a warm deist. He believed, he started a religion after he sort of demolished the church and everything in the French Revolution called the cult of the supreme being. And they made a whole statue for this being. It's basically a deistic god that they will say you still need to worship him, but you can't have a personal relationship with him because he doesn't care and he's not involved in this creation. Um, and then you, of course, get cold deists that says, no, there is a God, but you don't have to worship him. He doesn't care about you. He doesn't want to have a personal relationship with you. So why bother? Because at the end of the day, you are just a speck in his creation and you will become part of the universe when you die. They don't believe, for example, in an afterlife as well, the deists. So on the next slide, then the nature of the world around us. I just want to say, so a good book to look at when you want to learn more is James W. Sire's Universe Next Door. Explains this worldview quite well. Um, what is the nature of the world around us and how did it come into existence? I think it's quite clear if you look on the next slide that the deists believe the universe's existence comes from God or this being. It's not necessarily from the theistic God, but it is a God who caused the universe into existence. But we must remember it's a closed system for us and for God. It is a closed system, the universe, meaning the laws of nature are set in this universe. The laws of nature has a huge effect on us. We cannot alter them, and God Himself, who put them in place, cannot interact with creation because the laws of nature are set. Hence, why David Hume said miracles are not possible because it breaks the laws of nature, which in his mindset is not possible, and therefore God cannot interact. So, of course, the Bible has a lot of biblical miracles that it mentions that took place. And for a deist, they know that we cannot believe in that, as that it goes against the discoveries of science and so forth. So that's why I mentioned in the first place with the scientific discoveries of Isaac Newton, Galileo Galilei, Leonardo da Vinci, and all the Renaissance heroes, basically, these guys said, okay, so the world is built on mathematics, equations, and logic, and all these kind of things, and the laws of nature, which is in a sense true. It is, and that makes, but and that's why they started to question what which they would call the superstitions of the church, and they took even miracles and the claims of miracles, if they would put into that category. Um, so that's just an illustration of the deistic worldview. You have an indifferent God that created this universe of system of cause and effect, time, matter, space, and energy, the laws of nature, and so forth. And that is what it is. And what I would usually do with Christian theism in my worldview presentations is there would be an arrow pointing from God, the theistic God, into creation, meaning he can still interact into his creation. But in the deistic worldview, no, that is not what's going on there. So on the next slide, then the question is, what is a human being in this worldview? These are the typical questions. The questions I'm dealing with is the questions you ask for any worldview to understand the worldview. You ask these questions. Um, so for deists, human beings, like everything else, is just a part of the clock of the universe. It's just, we are just part of the system of cause and effect. There's no special meaning or purpose to your life. God set the things in motion, and you came into being as part of the motions of the universe, and so forth. Um, there's no divine purpose. There's no divine plan for your life, because God doesn't care in this worldview about you. You just are just part, one of the small gears in the universe, and you have your part to play, but that's about it, in the deistic worldview. Um, so just one thing. So they do, deists, of course, believe humans, of course, are intelligible. They can have relationship with one another. Have a personality. We have reason, the ability to think, which is a big thing for the deists. But they don't think that God necessarily would share any personal relationship or interaction with us. It's the big difference. Then the next one, so what happens to you when you die? Now, this was a very interesting thing that you will see with the deists. It depends if whether you're a warm or a cold deist, whether what you believe on this. So if you're a warm deist, you will believe in maybe in some of them, not all of them, on in some form of afterlife, but it's not with God. There might be some paradise or afterlife where your soul will go when you die, but many cold deists will say, no, when you die, that's it. There's nothing more. You're just a bag of chemicals and matter, and which will decompose in the ground, and that's it. So it depends basically what you are. But for cold deists, there's no such thing as a spirit or a soul, immaterial. Well, what the church referred to as an immaterial part of man. Um, but for the warm deists, they will say, no, there is something like that, and there might be an afterlife, but it's definitely not with God, for the warm deists. Okay. Is it possible to know anything? So the question, of course, here is, what is their measurement for knowing anything in deism? So for Christian theism, the big difference between Christian theism and deism was the whole thing on, for in Christian theism, it's the scriptures and God's revelation of himself in nature and in the scriptures that it gives us knowledge. But for deism, it was man's ability to reason and to think and to ask rational questions. So rationality becomes one of the main things, on the next slide, where we see as their way to know things. So, but the main thing is that what they will say is all history, all knowledge, all things we see that was invented by man needs to be reinterpreted through the lens of reason and rationality. So, for example, when it comes to the Bible, they will tell you we need to reinterpret the Bible through the eyes of logic, reason, and rationality. So when Jesus, for example, casts out the demon, no, 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 that's not what happens there. There's no such thing as demons. that was just a delusion that was happening there with that person. That person maybe had some schizophrenia or some delusions or whatever. And Jesus was just speaking into the time of the age at that time, how people would understand it. It's not really what happened there, for example, because demons don't exist, angels don't exist, miracles are not possible in the deistic worldview. And so there's some theological schools that also interpret the scriptures this way, for example, that they will say, no, that we need to reinterpret these things and understand it through our better enlightened understanding of the age. So that's their way to know things as they are. Um, Let's continue. So when it comes to morality, what is right and wrong, and how did we come to know it? The next question, this question. If we go to the next slide, so some deists will tell you that, like Descartes, for example, would believe that God, and this is based on a priori knowledge, meaning knowledge without experience, that God has placed a moral compass inside of us, that we can distinguish between right and wrong. And so, but for deists, basically, morality is given to us by God. We can know what is right and wrong, and they will believe in a universal sense of morality. And it comes from God, but again, God is not personal and God does not interact with us. And that's why one of the main reasons, as I said, why Descartes remained uh, in his belief in a God, this perfect being, as he referred to. Descartes also loved Plato, for example. He was a great follower of Plato's thinking. And Plato's forms, remember, where Plato said we all have a notion of perfect justice, perfect beauty, perfect morality. And when people question Plato, yeah, but Plato, we live in an imperfect world. How can you say that? Plato would say, yes, I know that, but how do you judge between what is right and wrong when you see something bad happens or something is ugly or something? Where do you get these notions from without a sense of perfect justice, perfect morality, and perfect beauty? And Plato believed in the forms, and the forms came from a God. But what's interesting with Plato is truth. He believed was above God again, and so forth. But that's a discussion for another time. Um, but so because of his great Platonic influence on Descartes' life, he believed, like I said, in this notion of a perfect being who would not deceive him because he's perfect, and therefore he can trust that there is a God and that we have these certain notions about morality, ethics, and so forth. Um, so they believe we can know right from wrong, but many deists, when they read the Bible, they will say there was no such thing as the fall. Take John Locke, for example, who said you were born with a blank slate. There's no, so in the Enlightenment, you had mainly two camps. You had those who discredit the senses, like Kant and Descartes, and was more falls into the anti-realist spectrum of philosophy. And then you had the empiricists like Hume and John Locke, who says, no, we can only know through sensical experience and empirical evidence. They would use that. And so Locke also was one of these empiricists who believe that there was no fall, because we are all born. It's almost sound when you think about it, it sounds like Pelagius's view. Pelagius, who also didn't believe in original sin, and Pelagius basically believed, no, as we are born without sin, but as in life we make certain bad decisions, then only we become sinful in the eyes of God. And John Locke also believed we were born without this sinful nature. It's in life we choose evil, and then therefore we become evil after that only. So many of them don't believe in the Bible's understanding of original sin and the fall of humanity, because they say, no, it's through logic and reason. Remember again that everything uh, becomes our measurement for everything. So for DS, what is the meaning of human history? How should we interpret human history? And it basically comes back to question 5, how do we know what we know? So deism states on the next slide that History, again, is linear. There's a beginning, there was a beginning to the universe, and there will be an end to the universe. And that all history happened, and the Bible, many things in the Bible they will say happened, but of course the miracles and all the superstition did not take place. So they will, again, like I said, all of history must again be reinterpreted and reevaluated through the eyes of human reasoning. And if it and then therefore certain things they will just pull into the category of myth, stories and legends, and therefore we need to understand them as such. They will say that's how people perceived the world back then. That's how they understood the world. But we are enlightened, and we know science, and we have discovered these things, and therefore we can use those tools to reinterpret what happened back then. Um, and there is certain things where we can say yes. For example, the Genesis creation story, um, that God really in 6 literal days create the universe, for example, or do we need to reinterpret that in a sense of what was Moses's understanding regarding those things, and what was he trying to communicate, for example, to the Hebrews in that? Now, because, for example, in Genesis, we see only that the sun and the moon and the stars were created on the fourth day. For the ancients, if you take, for example, in the way God says, let there be light, they understood the light like before the sun came up. Before you could see the sun, we already have light. They saw that light as separate from the sun's light back in the ancient times. So, what's interesting for me is only on the fourth day you have the sun and the moon and everything, and then after the first day it says it was morning, it was evening the next day. So that's an interesting thing just to look at when it comes to the creation account. So do we need to look at that and see maybe it was meant in a different way than what we understand it? And so there is some merit to that. But of course, the deists would discredit all miracles and these things. And so you have to bring an apologetic where you can say, defend the possibility of miracles when encountering deism. So what are the personal commitments, and is this worldview consistent, and so forth, of this worldview? So again, for the warm deists, again, it depends of whether you're warm or cold deist. For the warm deists, it would be to find God. Sorry, Gio, it's the next slide. I apologize. No, that's fine. So for warm deists, the commitment is to try to find this God and find out more about the God that created the universe. And like I said, Maximilian Robespierre tried to create a religion for worshiping a deistic God. But even when he started his cult of the supreme being with Maximilian Robespierre, it didn't last very long. They also killed him eventually, the French revolutionist. Um, but that is what will be their main commitment. But again, they will make clear to you, you cannot have a personal relationship with this God, but you can, through reason and science, get to know more about him by studying his universe. The cold deists, on the other hand, say, well, there's no point in trying to worship the creator or have any kind of relationship with him because he has distanced himself from us. And therefore, they would say, well, he has given us certain guides through our moral compass and reason. He has given us, and the best way will be just to understand life and to enjoy life. But you're wasting your time to try and have a personal relationship. You're wasting your time going to the mass or to church and everything. There's no point in that. So that would be their commitments, more or less. It's mainly self-centered and to find your own meaning and purpose in this universe that is separated from God. So on the next slide, we ask the question, is deism consistent and does it match reality? And so of course, deism, one thing where it does correspond to reality is showing that there is intelligent design behind the universe, that there is a hand behind the universe of a personal being or a being with a conscious being that caused the universe into existence. Of course, the big thing where we, of course, can say where we disagree with deists is on the thing of miracles and the possibility of miracles. Um, When it comes to miracles, remember David Hume was one of the big philosophers that made an argument against biblical miracles, where he said miracles break the laws of nature. I've never experienced a miracle in my life, therefore miracles are not possible. The thing is, if you think about it, and also Diaz says that the laws of nature are set. God cannot override them. We cannot interact with the universe because we cannot break the natural law. For example, when Jesus walks on water, that's breaking natural law. Turning water into wine, that's breaking natural law. That's not possible. And therefore, those miracles could not have happened, is what the Diaz would tell you. So the question is, how do we present an apologetic, an apologia, for the defense of biblical miracles? Because if the deists are right and miracles are not possible, then Christianity, and especially the resurrection of Christ, is not possible. And as Paul says, if the resurrection never happened, we of all people in the world should be pitied as Christians because we believe something that is false. But so how do we present an apologetic and against these arguments from the deists against Christian theism? So, well, the first thing is, and this is what Geisler makes quite well in his books, he says, creation itself was a miracle. And so firstly, you need to define what a miracle is. And he gives three characteristics of a biblical miracle. Firstly, it must be supernatural, or from a supernatural hand. It must transcend natural law and it must have divine purpose. That would make a biblical miracle. So the thing is, if for God to cause the universe into existence, the system of cause and effect, the system of space, time, matter, and energy, he has to be beyond the laws of the universe. If God could not interact or are below or the laws of nature are above him, he would never have been able to cause the universe into existence. Does that make sense? He needs to be beyond them. And so if God could cause the universe into existence, that means he's beyond them, then therefore creation itself is a miracle because there was nothing and now all of a sudden we have something. So if God can cause the universe into existence, then walking on water, turning water into wine, multiplying fish and bread is of course child's play for God. So, and that's what also the argument for miracles. If God possibly exists, then miracles are also possible. So you have to say it's impossible for God to exist to discredit miracles all in all. But if God exists, and according to the deistic worldview, he does, then miracles are indeed possible because God can transcend natural law because he created it in the first place. And if he is also sort of infringed by natural law and cannot interact because natural law is set, then he could never have created in the first place. So that's in the area I would go into with ideas is in with miracles especially and with natural law, that there is the possibility of miracles that God can still transcend. So we shouldn't say miracles break natural law. David Hume is wrong about that. Miracles is God transcending natural law, meaning he's beyond natural law and he needs to be beyond natural law to cause the universe into existence. So we can go to the next slide. Sorry, Gior. Yeah. So that's the area where deism fails in its worldview, in its understanding of natural law and God's interaction with natural law. God can interact and is beyond natural law, and therefore he is not bound to the law of gravity, to the laws of motion and the things we see in this universe. So that's where we say deism does not correspond to reality in terms of logic and philosophy and these kind of things. But the question is, how do we recognize deism then today? So many people say they are Christian, for example, and I want to end off of this last a couple of things. So many people will say they are Christian, but they still follow some deistic ideas about God. So there's very few people that these days, or I think now with the findings of science, the fine tuning of the universe, many atheists would consider deism a lot more. But but yeah. So that is so they would refer rather to a deistic God, but they are against the possibility of miracles. But when it comes back to the question of how do we identify deism, We see that, for example, when it comes to miracles. And I've seen some Christians, as they read the Bible and they read a miracle like Moses, where God parted the Red Sea, they'll say, no, 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 something else happened here. It could not have been a supernatural hand that intervened here and did that, for example. Or that when Jesus multiplied the fish or multiplied the bread, they will reinterpret it in the sense of, no, it was not something that literally necessarily happened. It was something, it's more as an understanding of God's compassion for people. We should read it in that. So there's this anti-supernatural reading into the scriptures that we see some Christians do. So, but again, it's very subtle, and it's not in your face kind of thing like the cold deists will have. And I don't know if you know, in 2010 there was this big debate at TGIF between some of our South African theologians, Saki Spannenberg and Wilhelm Wolmerans, against Mike Licona and William Lane Craig on the resurrection of Christ, where our theologians believed, and they wanted to start this movement called the New Reformation, where they believed that Jesus didn't literally rise from the dead. It was a resurrection in the hearts of the disciples. Because a physical resurrection or a historical resurrection is not possible. And so they debated with William Lane Craig and Mike Licona, two Americans who came here, and they had a debate in the aula at TGIF, and over a thousand people pitched up for the whole debate. And needless to say, the South African theologians were flawed. They were actually humiliated. And not that I'm not saying that Craig and Lacona did that maliciously, but the arguments the South African theologians presented for their case that there's no historical resurrection, if you weigh it up against the arguments from the Americans, was really, really not good. The Americans really, Craig and Lacona really destroyed all their arguments and showed to them that you have no ground to stand on to disprove the historical resurrection of Christ. So that was actually a good thing, a good victory for Christianity. But that is just to show to you, especially in our theological schools, you have either atheistic or deistic theologians that are in the seats of authority. And I've also even heard in certain, I was in cell groups where people have this anti-supernatural looking at scripture. Now, we cannot say that that miracle really happened. We need to reinterpret it through some other way, some other form of reason. And I'm like, why is a miracle not possible? If God exists and he is above the laws of nature, then he can do it. It's nothing for him. So what is the problem by saying, no, this really happened? The historical resurrection of Christ. So and again, where you can identify deism is asking people regarding the miracles in the Bible. How did they see it? And these things. But I think what I've also seen when the church, when I grew up as a teenager, and the church also I was in, there was this thing of also that people had this notion God is up there in the heavens and we are down here, and that's it. That's how I grew up also in church, and that was the subtle understanding regarding it. But Christian theism tells us no, God is personal. God interacts with us, and we can have that relationship with him. And that's the Christian theistic worldview comparing to the deistic worldview. So yes, I think that's it, what I wanted to say regarding the deism, what is the worldview of deism? Is it consistent? Does it correspond to reality, which we find no, there's problems with the worldview. And lastly, how do we identify deism in this day and age? And lastly, the apologetics we can present against deism for the defense for the Christian theism, especially for miracles, is tackling the notion of the laws of nature, that God is transcendent and he can interact and is beyond the laws of nature and can therefore alter them in his way. And lastly, just remember, when Jesus walks on water, it doesn't mean he breaks the law of gravity. He transcends it because after he walked on water, the law of gravity is still in place. It's still there. It's still functioning. It hasn't been broken or anything. So the whole idea of miracles break the laws of nature is completely wrong. It's not what the miracles are doing. If you have a being that can transcend them, then that is all that's happening there. It's just being transcended by that being. The law is still in place. And also, just on Hume's argument of he never experienced a personal miracle in his life. Well, that's only his personal experience. He's now saying, I discredit all other people's claims to miracles. So he has to go, it's like John Lennox said, he has to go and sit at every grave throughout of history and make empirical studies by saying, no resurrection is possible because I've looked at all the graves throughout of history and no one rose from the dead, for example. So that's also the problem of Hume's argument. But yeah, that was what I really wanted to communicate from the worldview of deism and how we as Christians can present an apologetic again for the Christian faith against the arguments from deism. Thank you very much. We'll probably have a Q&A now. Thank you.
It's more a comment than a question. I recently came across, I hadn't come across him before, an English guy called Glenn Scrivener. I don't know whether you, and he is Oxford trained, a theologian, but also a philosopher. And he he interacts with guys like, what's his name now? Dawkins. What he says is that Dawkins discredits all miracles. And then he says, but Mr. Dawkins, you believe in a lot of miracles. You believe that something came out of nothing, absolutely nothing. Where did you get that from? Then you believe that dead matter suddenly becomes living matter. How do you get that? And then you believe that living matter can become conscious matter as well. So you take on board a number of miracles that that you take for granted.
Yeah.
You know, who is the greater believer in miracles here? And you do that with no justification. The only thing that you can say is that, yeah, Darwin proved that we can get the appearance of design in living matter, but that leaves a whole lot of things unexplained as well. You know, why is this an ordered universe? How can, because evolution presupposes that we already have living matter. And I thought that was a very interesting perspective.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That's why we say, I love that. I'm going to remember that. Yeah. No, thank you for that. Yeah, no, absolutely. Because that's why we say creation itself is a miracle. That is what it is. Because why is there something rather than nothing? No, I love that. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Thank you, Saaiman. I think it is really insightful to kind of, also just where we are at currently in our culture. So deism isn't a word that's that well known. I think another ism, existentialism. So there might not be enough time, but if you can maybe just quickly, how did we go from deism to existentialism as one, and then maybe just one other thing. I hear a lot about the miracle part, and there's a lot of pushback in that, and maybe because the natural laws is what keeps things stable. So a part of our Christian worldview loves that there's natural laws, else nothing would make sense if everything just kind of goes into a different direction. But that being said, maybe with the age of theism, one thing I find particularly interesting, it's not just about the miracles, it's the knowledge that we can have. So and if miracles is out of the way, just what we can know, suddenly we find rationalism and empiricism, and so the opposites does not become anymore miracles, because that's no longer a thing. It's how can we know? So
Yeah.
that for me is a clue. Why are we aware? Why do we look? I think that may be also a clue why deism didn't hold, and kind of go on to the next thing.
Yeah.
If you noticed, Gio snuck in about 3 points. So respond to
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. So let me start with the last couple of ones. So yes, rationality, logic, reason are not bad things. The scientific discoveries that were made by Isaac Newton. I mean, I love science. I love logic. I love reason. I love rationality and everything. I think out of that, the arguments that they made using what they would call empirical science, reason, and logic, and so forth, was again misused. Even Hume's argument is illogical. It's not, and it's not it's not rational in what he's saying, and that's where you need to use the same tools like logic to discredit his argument and so forth. Because like that's why with the apologetics I presented is with his first premise of his argument, miracles break the laws of nature, is, well, if God does exist and he did create the universe, which they would agree on, the deist, then that is transcending natural law. It's not breaking natural law. So we use the same tools that they use, which is a good tool, logic, reason, science, and these things. So we can know things through those tools, and that's what we refer to in Christianity as general revelation, knowing God from his creation and through human conscience and so forth. And special revelation, of course, is the Bible. Then just basically what I wanted to say on the whole thing of existentialism, how we got there. So again, Sayer's book on the universe next door explains that quite well. So we had in the Middle Ages Christian theism, with the Enlightenment deism started. Then with Darwin coming onto the scene, eventually it led to the naturalism that you don't need a God. That was the whole argument. You don't need a God for the universe to exist and for life to develop and evolve and everything. But what happened after the naturalism, we had Friedrich Nietzsche and everything, who started to say, okay, but if this is the case, if God does not exist, we are in trouble. We are in big trouble, because then everything is subjective and everything is open for interpretation. Then there is no absolute morality. There's no absolute all these things. And the nihilists, then nihilism came out as I would say, the offspring of naturalism. If there's no God, they said, oh, how do we know we even exist? How do we know this is just not another hallucination or a dream or another chemical reaction in my brain? And so John Paul Sartre, who is the father basically of atheistic existentialism, came with the idea, try to answer the questions of nihilism by asking, okay, we live in a purposeless universe. And so you refer to the two worlds. You have the objective world and the subjective world. And so John Paul Sartre said, we can give to the meaningless, purposeless, objective universe meaning through our subject. That's where existentialism started to come in, which eventually led to the postmodern worldview which we have today. I give meaning to life. I give purpose to a purposeless universe. I get my own identity because everything is subjective. So that is, and very briefly, if I can explain where we came from, deism all the way to existentialism. Yeah.
Okay. We already have a subject for what we ask you to speak about next then.
Okay.
Okay, Jake, and then me.
Great. Thanks for that talk, Simon. You spoke earlier about commitment consistent with this worldview, and obviously we know that worldviews have consequences. So I'd like you to comment, if you could, on maybe thought patterns, choices, views that you think are consistent with this worldview in modern society.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we don't really know. So Immanuel Kant is the main philosopher I would refer to when it comes. He lived in the Enlightenment period. And his ideas have influenced Christians as well, very great, especially on this notion of where people speak of there certain things are spiritual and certain things are non-spiritual in my life. Because and this is the whole thing about what deism started to do was, and where they discredit the whole thing of what's that the document of higher hypothesis. There's another name for it, but it was the whole thing that basically, if you go to Turkish, you study the whole thing, is that basically discrediting the authority of the Bible. Because the Bible, of course, is special revelation. But when it comes to Kant, especially, Kant said we can't prove God scientifically. Or religion cannot be proven scientifically. We should separate it to. It's a whole different category, whole different field of study. We threw that into morality and ethics because, again, there's where Kant is correct. Science cannot prove ethics or morality. It's one of the things science cannot prove. However, Kant said we live every day as if God exists. So Immanuel Kant, and so where you see people, where Christians will speak, yeah, I have a secular job. We know what they mean by that. It's not a church job. It's not a job in ministry. But that is such a wrong, and that's not a Christian thinking. That's a typical Kantian influence there. And Christians speak about that is spiritual, that is non-spiritual. So what they mean about I pray every day, or when I pray, or when I read Bible, I go to church, that's spiritual. But when I go home and I do my chores or I go to work, that is non-spiritual. That is not the way the Christian should think about it. That's a Kantian influence. So that's where one area where we see that. The Christians should see everything I do is to the glory of God. The way I discipline my child, or the way I treat my child, my wife, is also spiritual matters, if we can use that language. Everything we do is to the glory of God. So that's one area. And then, of course, you see and how people look at the Bible, Christians or many other people. And that would be in the sense of, now, we can't interpret this as something that actually happened, the miracles and those things. So Immanuel Kant is the great influencer of how people think. And these are certain deistic ideas that we see still walk around today, that people, the way people speak. That's how we say how you identify worldview is here, how people speak, how they live, and also their personal relationship with God. Is there one, or is it non-existent? I hope that answers your question. Okay.
So just by the way, fun fact, it's Immanuel Kant's 300th birthday this year. Really? So you go to a bookshop in Germany and they will foreground him.
Yeah.
So there will be So as in the deism is certainly still with us. Two comments, just playing around with it, but please treat them as questions. Or one is, I'm wondering whether African traditional religion is actually in some ways a form of deism. Okay, so it's the idea of the creator God, but now he's sort of removed himself. So there's still a belief in the supernatural, yes, but God is distant and unknowable. So maybe it's a form of deism. Okay. And second comment is, I suppose it's just to follow on from where you went just now, is that I think one of the reasons, or again, just I'm playing around with it, that we are struggling with, or that you also have a lot of deism in the church today, is that we are not strong on a theology of God the sustainer. Yes. Okay, so we are good on God the creator, and maybe also on God who does miracles, but what about God the sustainer? So this idea of every breath that we take comes from him, and God sends the rain, and he feeds the wild animals, and those are the does it make sense? So sure. We then have this view of I suppose how you went with the secular sacred divide thing, that in order to God is there and I can communicate with him, but somehow I get myself into the God zone, which is a different zone from this clockwork universe. So I think in a lot of Christianity, the clockwork also just keeps going, but every now and then I get transported beyond the clockwork, and then that's where I find God. And every now and then God tinkers with the clockwork, but normally it just runs. Okay, so when he tinkers, we call it a miracle, but those miracles are rare. All right. So what about all those time periods between the tinkering? So we really need to, I think, strengthen our theology of God the sustainer.
So that's a good point. I'll get to the African one now. I just want to make a comment on the last one. I absolutely agree with you. So we must understand there's a difference between, we call it God's sovereignty and God and miracles. There's a difference. So, or God's providence and God's supernatural miracles. A miracle, remember, is a supernatural work of God that transcends natural law, like Jesus walking onto water, turning water into wine, etc. And it has a divine purpose as well. But for example, like Thorsten said, when God sends the rain, or when God sustains life he uses the normal natural ways to do that. He doesn't transcend the natural law in doing it, but it is still God's providence. It's still God's hand behind it, and he interacts, but he uses the natural laws he placed into the universe to do it. So we just need to differentiate between what we call God's providence and God's miracles. For example, I like to use this example also. If I trust God for finances, and God lays it onto someone's heart to bless me with an X amount of money, and God does that, I've seen that in my life. You don't call that a miracle, it's God's providence. But if they fell money out of nothing, out of the sky, which God can do, of course, then we would call that a miracle. It's not the best example, I know, but it is an example to illustrate the point. So yeah, we just need to differentiate between miracles and God's providence, because there is a difference between the two. But God does in his providence on a daily basis. I mean, Jesus says he feeds the birds of the field and looks after his creation and so forth. So yeah, briefly adding to what you said, I fully agree with that. And then on the African traditional religion, that's just something I didn't think about, but it is true in a sense. Africans do believe that God has separated himself from his creation. And of course, we can only communicate him through the ancestors and so forth. But they very much believe in the supernatural and the workings of supernatural. And just on a last comment, there's a thing in which we call dark miracles, which of course demonic forces are the source behind them, where they, of course, because they are also beings that are not bound to the laws of nature like we are. They are, as Thomistic philosophy will say, God is the non-form, angels and the celestial is what we call those who assume form, and we are a combination of form and non-form. But that's deep. That is Thomistic philosophy for you. Yes.
Okay, we are on 7:30, so either brief or we close first and then you ask your question.
It strikes me that you've presented a very post-deist point of view.
Okay.
But the thing that I find missing is a sort of pre-deist thing, is that the deists believed that God wasn't interested in his creation. He didn't care about it. He started it off, and like the watchmaker, once he sold it to the client, then what the client does with him is no concern. But for the Christian point of view, God was very interested in his creation in that he became part of it. The uncreated became created. Jesus was God and man.
Yes.
And I sort of have a slight problem with the idea of miracles, in the sense that Jesus walked on water in order to contradict the deists who didn't exist then. I mean, the closest people to the deists at that time were the Sadducees, who didn't believe in resurrection.
Yeah.
And yeah.
Yeah.
I don't think Jesus walked on water to sort of contradict the deists.
No, of course not.
And the problem with the deists is that they miss the point.
Yeah.
Because they are sort of fixated on miracles as something to do with the laws of nature. But it's really, Jesus is showing that God is concerned with his creation.
Yes. Yeah, no, I agree. I fully agree with that. And that's the point we're making, is the arguments that they present deism to discredit Christian theistic understanding of miracles is, so that's why we refer to Jesus, because a guy like Thomas Jefferson would read Jesus walks on water, tears it out of his Bible, because of course he doesn't believe in miracles. So that's why we refer to that, because that is what the deists would have done. Some deists would have done in their time. So yeah, Jesus, I think the fact that Jesus did miracles was to show to us, as you said, that he is God incarnate in human form, took on human form. But yeah, so no, I fully agree with you. And it's interesting that you bring up the Sadducees, because yeah, they didn't believe in the resurrection or angels and these kind of things. So yeah, no, thank you.